There's a nice lady to tell us that. So again, welcome to our ONCA session. I'd like to start off with a land acknowledgement. I am in our Acton office today in Ontario, but as we convene digitally today, we do so in different locations across the region and perhaps even across the province. So today, as I said, I am on the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. And this is also the traditional territory of many nations, including the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat peoples, and it's also home now to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. So here at Community Development Halton and Volunteer Halton, we are very proud to promote the spirit of helping, sharing, and caring for our neighbors without expectation, which has been exemplified by each of these nations as the first peoples of this land for thousands of years. And we also wish to acknowledge our gratitude for the ongoing opportunity to live, work, and build community on this land. We all have a collective responsibility to care for each other, to care for these lands. And I personally believe that it is past time that we need to turn reflection into action. And I challenge myself and everyone on today's call to commit to at least one tangible step to move the work of truth and reconciliation forward. If you are in the Halton region, there are many fantastic resources that can help you with this. There's an organization called Grandmother's Voice. There's also some great contacts through our local libraries that you might wish to tap into. I also recognize for myself that this is a history that wasn't taught to me in school, so I continue to learn, and I continue to be eternally grateful for our First Nations peoples who were very persistent in telling their stories and insisting that they be heard. Thank you. So, as I mentioned, we are here today to talk about the ONCA process, and I am delighted to welcome Benjamin Miller. Benjamin is a staff lawyer on the Nonprofit Law Project, where he focuses on the legal needs of nonprofits and charities. This is now part of the Ontario Nonprofit Network. So over the past 7 years, Benjamin has answered thousands of nonprofit law questions, developed and delivered dozens of workshops, and has developed an online interactive tools, including a bylaw builder for the ONCA process. He holds a JD and an MPP from the University of Toronto and an MA in political theory from the University of Ottawa. He's actually coming to us from, I'm not sure if it's sunny Winnipeg today, but we are delighted to have Benjamin with us. And I'm going to stop talking so Benjamin can start. Welcome, Benjamin.
Well, thank you. Always a pleasure to be here. Hopefully, we'll turn those thousands of questions into thousands of more questions. And it's actually not been so sunny here. It's as my hosts here have reflected on to me. If they wanted to live in Toronto, they would have moved. But the weather is very Toronto-ish weather, so I feel at home. Just reflecting on the land here, Treaty 1 territory, the homeland of the Métis, the Ojibwe, the Sioux, the Anishinaabe, and the Cree peoples, among other First Nations. One thing I was struck by when I first came to Manitoba is it really is very flat. They're not kidding. It's super flat. You can see very far in advance. And one thing I like to tell people about the ONCA transition process and about your governing documents in general is that the rules aren't really for now. Now, when everybody's getting along, when everybody likes each other, that's not really when the rules are relevant. The rules are relevant 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, when people hate each other, when there's some deep controversial topic that's dividing everybody, when people who have no clue why you originally founded the organization are now running the organization. That's when the rules really matter. So throughout today's discussion, I hope you have in mind that you're not just writing and updating these governing documents for yourself. You're writing them for the people far in the future, maybe 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is. That's who you should have in mind as the true audience for what we're learning today. So, as you heard, my name's Benjamin Miller. I'm a staff lawyer with ONN on the Nonprofit Law Ontario project. We deliver workshops like these on various areas of law that affect nonprofits. So to learn more about our information that can help you and to maybe answer some of your questions that we can't address today, I'm going to put our website in the chat, nonprofitlaw.cleo.on.ca. A disclaimer before I give you a brief overview of the ONCA, because as a lawyer, I'm very fond of disclaimers. Disclaimer number one. Today is general legal information. It's not legal advice specific to your situation. That's not because I don't want to help. It's because I cannot help effectively without actually having your governing documents in front of me, reading them, understanding the history of your organization, understanding your culture, and what would make sense for you. So when I answer your questions, it's not wink, wink, nudge, nudge. This is actually legal advice. No, no, no. It's really legal information. Point number one. Point number two, today's about the ONCA. If you have other legal questions, for example, Heather sent me some legal questions ahead of time that touched on HST and some other tax law issues that touched on fiduciary obligations and so on. I'm happy to address those questions, but the scope of today is mainly focused on ONCA, Ontario's Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. So if I don't say otherwise, assume I'm just talking about that piece of law, not the other laws that might apply to you. Disclaimer number three. Today cannot be comprehensive. We can't do a deep dive on every question, right? It's just an overview. It's just meant to orient you to get you started on the correct answers to the questions you may have. And finally, number four, there's a difference between law and best practices. Here, I don't presume to have any expertise in all the best practices and how to run the most successful nonprofit and so on. I'm sure you are much more knowledgeable than I am in many of the areas that lead to you having a successful nonprofit. I know one slice of that pie, and that slice is the law. The law is intended to give you minimum standards. It's meant to highlight options for you. You are better placed to understand which of those options are right for you. So with those disclaimers in mind, I'll give you a general overview of where we are in the ONCA transition process, and then we can jump into questions. Maybe Heather, you can give me some of the questions that were submitted ahead of time, and then we'll go to the audience for your current questions. So Ontario's Not-for-Profit Corporations Act is a general piece of corporate legislation that applies to nonprofits incorporated in Ontario. So if you are federally incorporated, somebody asked this question ahead of the session. If you are federally incorporated, ONCA does not apply to you. You can save yourself the next hour and a half. If you are unincorporated, so you're a grassroots group, ONCA does not currently apply to you. You may choose to become incorporated under ONCA, but as of now, as an unincorporated group, ONCA does not apply to you. If you are a cooperative corporation incorporated under the Cooperative Corporations Act, or a condo corporation incorporated under the Condo Corporations Act, although you may be nonprofit, ONCA does not apply to you. Okay, so we're really talking to nonprofits who were incorporated under Ontario's Corporations Act or some special acts like the Agriculture and Horticultural Organizations Act or the Ontario Historical Societies Act and so on. Those are the organizations to which ONCA applies. So ONCA took effect on October 19th, 2021. And that started a 3-year transition period ending on October 19th, 2024. So we're right now getting towards the end of this 3-year transition period. But during this 3-year transition period, ONCA applies, but if your governing documents were valid before ONCA took effect, they keep on being valid until October 19th, 2024, even if they contradict ONCA. Okay, so what that means practically is that if you have a question about your rules of governance, the first place you are going to look is in your own governing documents. If you can find an answer there, good. As long as it was valid before, it keeps being valid. But if you cannot find an answer in your governing documents, as they say, if your governing documents are silent on an issue, now you are looking to ONCA for the answer. So that's the difference that during this transition period. At the end of this transition period, on October 19th, 2024, well, what's going to happen? Well, you don't need to worry. No organization is going to poof out of existence. There aren't going to be any ONCA police knocking on your doors and asking you, have you complied with the ONCA? No one's being dragged off to jail. There are no fines. So you may think to yourself, well, then why should we care at all? Well, the answer is twofold. So number one, what will happen on October 19th, 2024 is your governing documents will be considered to automatically transition over to the new rules. That doesn't mean that your governing documents will magically change. What it will mean is that what's written down on paper in your governing documents may not reflect what your rules actually are at law. So that's going to create a bit of a confusing situation. To avoid that confusing situation, you may want to take steps before October 19th, 2024 to update your governing documents. So that's one reason you may want to take steps to transition to ONCA now. Uh, a second reason, perhaps more inspiring, is that it gives you an opportunity to take a good look at your governance. If you haven't looked at your governing documents in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, or maybe you haven't changed it since you were incorporated in the 1920s. It happens. I've had organizations like that talk to me. Um, don't worry, that's perfectly normal. This is really an opportunity to ask some basic questions about, are your governance systems and processes working for you, or are they completely irrelevant and so you just ignore them, right? This is an opportunity for renewal of those decision-making processes. Um, Okay, so basically the ONCA transition process involves looking at your current governing documents, identifying what needs to change or what you might want to change, drafting those changes either by writing completely new bylaws or by amending your current bylaws. Our website, as you heard earlier, has tools to help you do both those things. And then going and approving the changes. And basically the approval process is it goes to the board votes on it, changes to your bylaws are immediately effective, changes to your articles are effective only after you've submitted them with the government. Once the board has approved it, then you need a members meeting. Your members vote on changes to bylaws. It's a simple majority unless your bylaws say otherwise. Changes to articles are a 2/3 majority. Once you've made the changes to your bylaws, you're basically good. The changes to the articles need to be filed with the Government of Ontario. That is an overview of the whole process. I'm now going to finish speaking and turn it over to Heather for some of your questions.
Okay, perfect. So there was a question in the chat that just wants, someone's asked to clarify that ONCA does or does not apply to federally regulated charities.
Whether or not you're a registered charity doesn't matter for our purposes. The question is, where are you incorporated? If you are incorporated federally under the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, so meaning you do your annual filings to Corporations Canada, on the top of your letters patent, it has the Ministry of Industry and so on. It doesn't talk about the Ontario government. So if you're federally incorporated, ONCA does not apply to you. If you are a provincially incorporated organization, that for tax purposes has a registered charity status, ONCA does apply to you. The fact that you're a charity doesn't matter. The thing that matters is that you're incorporated provincially.
Okay. Just one second, sorry. All right, trying to fix a question I had there. Okay, so questions that were submitted ahead of time. Are cash or equipment donations considered taxable income if an organization's main income are donations with a bit of fundraising? It says, when are you able to get GST, HST refunded or expenses? And I'm just going to go through the questions as they were submitted.
Great. So to the question of whether they're taxable income, if you are a nonprofit organization, you are tax exempt. So none of your income is taxable. Whether or not you qualify as a nonprofit organization for tax purposes actually is a completely different question from anything the ONCA deals with. This is a question exclusively under the Income Tax Act. There are nuances and complexities to this, and it really depends on the situation. But the bottom line is, if you are a nonprofit that operates effectively on a cost recovery basis, you don't plan to make a profit. You aren't taking the money that you get in and distributing it to the members, things like that. There's a good chance you're a nonprofit for income tax purposes. And then it doesn't matter how much income you have, that income is not taxable. As for GST and HST rebates, that's outside the scope of today. The answer is where credits or not.
So Benjamin, you started to break up there. We heard HST, GST. I think you started to say is not part of the scope, and we missed, and then we
Yeah.
missed it. So you could just repeat that?
Sure. So not part of the scope of today, but the bottom line is it depends what your goods and services are. That's what determines whether or not you can collect credits on the NHST rebates and so on.
Okay, great. So the next question, someone submitted says, I have a question about board of director compensation. What is reasonable and how is it broken down? For example, can you pay for specific jobs a board member may undertake or pay an honorarium?
So this is a great question. It comes up a lot. The rule has not changed under ONCA. Okay, so this is the same before and it's the same now. So the rule is basically this. By default, for regular nonprofits, okay, so we're setting aside charities for the moment. For regular nonprofits, by default, you can pay your directors both for work they do in other capacities, so jobs they might do, and for their work as directors, such as paying them an honorarium. You can do that unless your bylaws or articles is a new term for letters patent, unless your bylaws or your articles prohibit it. Okay, so you're allowed to do it. But in doing so, you must follow conflict of interest rules, which means that, for example, the director cannot be at the meeting where their compensation is being voted on. It's not just that they leave the room for that item on the agenda, they cannot be at the meeting. Once they're not at the meeting, how the board actually goes about determining what level of compensation, either for their work as a director or for work they're doing in other capacities, how they determine what is reasonable will be very context dependent. But the bottom line is that they need to make their decision based on the best interests of the nonprofit. So they'll be looking at things like what is the typical cost for paying somebody to do this type of work, getting maybe other quotes. Why was it given to this director? Why not? Why didn't you look to see if other people were able and willing to do it, etc. That's the kind of process that if it was ever challenged, a court might look at to see that the board did its due diligence in deciding to pay a director or not. All of that is for regular nonprofits. The picture is very different for charities. For charities, the answer is you can never pay a director for their work as a director. No amount is reasonable. It's all prohibited to pay a director for their work as a director. Um, Whether or not you are allowed to pay a director for other work they do for the organization is determined by a guide called Payments to Directors and Connected Persons, which is published by the public guardian and trustee. The short answer is it is rarely allowed. And there is a very onerous process you have to go through as a charity if you want to pay uh, a director for work they do in other capacities. But that is the guide to learn more about the process.
Great, thank you. We have several questions around letters patent and articles.
Mhm.
So I'm going to try to consolidate several of them. So I have one here. It says, we have bylaws in place and we are a registered charity. The material for the new act mentions articles. I am confused on what articles may exist or what we need to do. Do we just focus on getting the bylaws updated and approved by the organization? What is needed for articles? Other ones that come up, we have some questions in the chat around, please explain again the impact to letters patent.
Mhm.
And can an organization change their articles when submitting the amended bylaws? Question of whether or not we have to file our bylaws.
Mhm. Okay, so lots of great, very common questions. So firstly, I'll just take a moment to explain what letters patent are. Letters patent is the document the government would have first sent you when you became incorporated. These tend to be short documents, so don't worry if yours is short. It would have a few essential pieces of information like the name of your organization, the names of your founding directors, the purposes of your organization, your founding address, and other purposes you may have asked for at that time, such as special rules around where the assets will go if you dissolve, things like that. So that's your letters patent. Under ONCA, this document is now referred to as articles. This change in name does not require you to do anything. It's just new terminology. So when you see the term articles online or when I use the term articles, just know it's referring to your letters patent. So what do you need to do with your articles as part of the ONCA transition process? One of the new elements of ONCA is that it requires a number of things that could have been put in the bylaws previously to now be put in the articles. I'll give you three examples. Number one, you can have multiple types of members in your organization, known as member classes. Previously, if you had multiple types of members, you could set that out in your bylaws. You could say we have three classes of members, Class A, Class B, and Class C, and that would be fine to put in the bylaws. Now, ONCA requires us to put it in the articles. That's example number one. Example number two, the number of directors. Previously, you could put the number of directors in your bylaws. ONCA now requires us to put this information in our articles and allows us to set out a range of seats on our board, a range of directors. So for example, whereas previously we could only say 7, or we could say 20 or 9, give a fixed number. Now we can say minimum 7, maximum 20, or minimum 12, maximum 32. But in order to do this, we have to do it in our articles. Example number 3. I mentioned a dissolution clause, a rule that says what happens to your assets when the organization closes down. Previously, you could have a line like that in your bylaws. Now, ONCA requires a line like that to be put in your articles to be effective. So, however, ONCA has special transition rules that say if you have your list of membership classes in the bylaws and you have your number of directors and certain other things that need to be put in the articles, if those keep being in your bylaws, even past October 19th, 2024, it's fine. Those rules aren't going to be automatically amended. So you can keep having your current structure as long as you want. But if you ever want to make changes to these rules that ONCA says need to be in your articles, if you ever want to make changes, you're going to have to do so in the articles. If you make the changes in your bylaws, they're going to be ineffective, and that's going to lead to problems. So while it's not required to make changes to your articles as part of the ONCA transition process, it is most lawyers advise most of the time that you will want to make changes in your articles to, at the very least, move over those things that are in your bylaws now that ONCA requires to be put in the articles. For more information on this, there is a page on our website called Articles. Now, to the question of do we need to file the bylaws versus the articles, the bylaws do not need to be filed unless you are a registered charity. If you are a registered charity, your updated bylaws do need to be filed with CRA, not because CRA is Canada Revenue Agency, not because the Canada Revenue Agency approves your changes, but simply because they want to have them on file. But if you're a regular nonprofit, not a charity, you do not need to file your bylaws, but you do need to file your any changes to your articles. The changes to your articles are called articles of amendment. Those do need to be filed, and there are three ways to file them: through the Ontario Business Registry is number one, which you can do online; by mail, through downloading a form from the Ontario Forms repository and mailing it in; or number three, by working with a third-party provider, and there are two that are listed on the Ontario Business Registry website, and there are additional fees to that.
Okay, great. Thank you. There's a related question here around membership. It says we have a group called Members at Large that pay a nominal fee of $5 a year. They are able to vote at the annual meeting and get other benefits. We are struggling with the role for this group and how it fits with the board and the executive. In the materials that I reviewed for the Act, there was mention of more classes or groups of members. Can you explain how these can be used? Is there a different approach or structure for the members at large?
Great. So one of the, and maybe I'll start providing links in the chat that as I reference things. So give me just 1 second. We have, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to provide the link I just mentioned about the articles. And then we have a page on our website, which is deals with membership structures. So for more information on the different types of structures you can have and the pros and cons of each, this page is a good starting point. But I'll give you a brief answer now. So firstly, the question of what's the role of the membership at large, and secondly, what could we do with our ability to have multiple classes of members? So the membership at large. The idea of membership um, in nonprofit corporations comes a bit by analogy to the role of shareholders in for-profit corporations. So a shareholder owns a for-profit corporation, and so the for-profit corporation, the business ultimately answers to its shareholders. Its shareholders, have important powers like replacing the board, approving major decisions, etc. In a nonprofit, the members do not own the nonprofit, but the nonprofit answers to the members, whoever those people are. So the members have the power to elect the directors, remove the directors, their approval is required for major decisions like changing the bylaws, etc. The idea of having membership at large, meaning let's say anybody who supports the organization can be a member, is a nonprofit expressing the idea that we want to be accountable to anybody who kind of supports the mission. We want to have a kind of broad-based accountability or broad-based stakeholders. So this idea, although people may not be so intentional about this, they may not consciously think this when they make the decision, yes, we want to have open membership. But this broad-based definition of membership reflects an idea of civil society that we as a nonprofit want to answer to anybody who shares our values and objectives. And that's what it accomplishes, having a membership at large. So they have a different role from the directors and the officers and the staff. The role of the directors is to oversee the operations of the nonprofit. The role of the officers is maybe to carry out that work, and the staff to carry out that work. The role of the members is not to necessarily be involved in the nitty-gritty, but as a collective to hold the organization to account for its mission and its values, and to ensure the right people are in the board positions that the community trusts to really oversee the work of the nonprofit. So who you trust with that role, that oversight role, is really your fundamental question. Now, I should say also, practically speaking, your membership could also be a source of volunteers, of donors, of potential future directors, and so on. So some people like a broad-based membership as a way to engage donors, to source potential volunteers, etc. Now, what about a multi-class membership? So there are many different kinds of multiple class memberships, but they all try to find different ways to engage different stakeholders. So I'll give you one example. One example of a multi-class membership is what's called a hybrid membership, where the only voting members are the directors. So they elect themselves, they appoint their own successors, and so on and so forth. So there is kind of tight-knit control over the organization concentrated in the board. But there is a second non-voting class of members who, let's say, anybody in the area qualifies for, or anybody who donates qualifies for. And this is a way to get some of those participation benefits, as I said, potential donors, volunteers, etc. But they don't have governance control. If you're worried they're going to come in and take over, or they're going to cause problems, the fact that they don't have a vote guards against that a bit. Another example of a multi-class membership is, let's say you have a youth league, okay, or a recreation organization. So you want your players to be members because you want to empower them. You want them to be part of the governance. Their voice matters. But you don't necessarily want them to have a vote over decisions like mergers and major sales of assets and so on, because at the end of the day, as youth, they may not have so much experience in those areas. So you have two classes. One class of membership are the parents, maybe, and another class of membership are the players. The parents have the vote, the players also get notices of meeting and so on. They can attend, but they don't have a vote. So that's an example of you use multiple classes to involve different stakeholders in different ways.
Okay, great. We have a few questions around the role of executives, presidents, chairs, and things like that. So I'm going to read out a couple of them because they probably all have very similar answers. It says we currently have a board with 3 directors that provide oversight, executive with officers that manage this, in this case, it's a theater, and members at large that pay a nominal fee and can vote at the annual meeting. Should we look to combine the board and the executive? That structure looks more in line with the new act. What other options are available? And then Denise has asked some questions in the chat. Can you please clarify if the chair can hold other executive director roles on the board? Is it wrong for the officers and directors to be the only members of the organization?
Okay. So I'll take a step back from these specific questions first and kind of set out the basic structure of members, directors, officers as it's thought about in the ONCA. So the first thing to note is that members, directors, and officers can all be the same people. So you could have the same people hold each role, but they don't have to be. So your members could be completely different people, your directors can be completely different people, and most of your officers can be completely different people. Okay. The members, as I mentioned, have this power to elect the directors and they approve major decisions. Your directors fundamentally are the people who are responsible for overseeing the organization collectively, meaning individual directors don't have individual powers, they have the collective ability to make decisions that bind the organization. And then officers are people who are given specific executive jobs to carry out and are appointed by the board unless your governing documents say otherwise. So there are these kind of 3 levels of increasing granularity. The members are they exercise oversight in a high level way. The directors can exercise very detailed oversight or very general oversight, depending on whether they're a policy board or a working board. And then officers have, detailed nitty-gritty jobs to carry out. And then you might have staff and volunteers and so on under them as well. So to the first question of whether whether these should be, sorry, I'll work backwards. To the last question of whether these should be the same people or not. The advantage of making them all the same people is that it's generally speaking easier to do governance because you have a smaller group of people who need to be informed. So administratively things go faster. There are fewer names to keep track of. And if you are concerned that somebody's going to come in and take over your organization and take it in a radically different direction, that risk is mitigated because you have fewer people involved. Okay, so as long as you make sure those few people are all on the same page and you keep relationships between them happy and healthy, then the risk of takeover is very little. It's almost impossible for an outside actor to take over an organization if the members, directors, and officers are all the same people. The downside is that creates a very insular governance environment. There aren't so many opportunities for checks and balances from outside perspectives. And although it may be quote unquote disruptive and more work to involve outside stakeholders, that may be the vital work of community building. And so it's a kind of false economy to think you are saving time and money by not talking to them. They may be exactly the people you need to engage and want to engage and so on. And so you benefit from there being a separation of powers between the members, the directors, and the officers by getting more perspectives and so on. Especially Heather mentioned at the beginning in the land acknowledgement about educating ourselves, engaging in reconciliation, etc. If you are on a reconciliation journey or an anti-racism journey or just a more general equity journey, and you're looking for opportunities to increase the diversity within your organization, by just because you limit the number of governance positions by making your directors and members the same people, you are limiting opportunities for diversity. You create more opportunities for diversity by making the members, directors, and officers different people. To the next question about can you please clarify if a chair can hold other executive director roles on the board? So I mentioned that most officer positions can be people who aren't your directors. That's true. Under ONCA, the chair, who is your only required officer position, you don't have to have any other officer positions. You're only required to have a chair. If that chair needs to be a director. Okay, so that the chair can hold other officer positions if you want. That's up to you. By default, it's allowed. You can restrict it and you could say no, no officer can hold more than one position. The advantage of saying no officer can hold more than one position is again, you are separating the powers. So there are more checks and balances. You are also guarding against a risk of burnout because, yes, maybe this year somebody is very keen and excited to take on lots of different roles, but how sustainable is that? And are you creating a pipeline of leadership and getting many people holding different executive roles so they can move into increasing levels of seniority, etc.? By concentrating the positions in one or a few people, you are cutting yourself off potentially from those pipelines, and you may be increasing the likelihood of burnout from those few very engaged volunteers. Now, Heather, the first question you asked, could you repeat it? Because I think I've forgotten that one.
Yeah, so it says, we currently have a board with 3 directors that provide oversight, an executive with officers that manage the theater, and a members at large that pay a nominal fee and can vote at the annual meeting. Should we look at to combine the board and the executive, as that structure looks more in line with the new act, and what other options are available?
So, as I mentioned, the default under the ONCA is that most of your officers do not need to be the directors, meaning you do not need to combine the executive and the board, except in the role of chair. The chair does need to be a director. The other officers, it's entirely, or executives as you may call them, it's entirely up to you whether they are directors. The advantage of having your officers be directors is that it's fewer people who have to be at the board meetings, for example. If you want all your officers at the board meetings, it's more scheduling work to try to get a bunch of more people to be there at the right time. Um, the disadvantage is, let's say you've got great directors and they are willing to be directors, but there are other people out there who might be excellent at a specific officer role but don't want to be general directors. They either don't want to commit or they don't want the liability or whatever it is. For example, I've been involved in nonprofits where I was the secretary, but I didn't want to be a director. So if you are having recruitment problems in getting a qualified executive, one way you can ease these recruitment problems is by making sure that your officers are not required to be directors.
Okay. So we've got one question here that's quite lengthy, and I'm just trying to make sure I pull out the right questions. So in that line, this particular individual's asked, in the regulations, there's a reference to a chair and a president. We don't have a chair, but we do have a president. Do we need both, or can we specify our own choice in our bylaws?
You're only required to have a chair. You are not required to have a president. You do not have the option of changing the title chair. Somebody has to have that title, either in English or the French equivalent.
Okay, great. Okay, so there's some questions here around the next steps once you've done your bylaws and are looking to do the filings on them. So again, I'm going to try to pull them all together. If the membership information now needs to be in the articles, do we need a special members meeting to pass a special resolution before October 18th? Or can we include the special resolution at our regular annual meeting, which is typically held in November?
So it's a great question. And as we get closer to the end date, these scheduling questions come up more and more. Um, so the I'll take this at 2 levels. So firstly, what's like legally possible, and then sort of the what how to avoid confusion and so on. So technically speaking, if all that you are changing in your articles is the membership classes, you could do that before October 19th, 2024 or after. It doesn't matter because ONCA says the membership classes, they keep being valid. So you can do that whenever. With that being said, if you are passing a whole bunch of changes to the bylaws and the articles at the same time, and you are thinking about doing that after October 19th, then you could run into problems because what will happen on October 19th, as I mentioned, is the rules will automatically transition over. If some of your rules that will automatically transition over are things like voting thresholds for passing changes to your articles or your bylaws, or what is the degree of notice required to be given for a meeting to be valid, etc. If those things are out of step with ONCA and then they change in October, that may screw up your November meeting, because you're going to need to follow the now ONCA rules rather than the rules in your governing documents for the actual approval process. So it's technically possible, and in fact, you could do it in stages. You could do all the bylaws stuff before October 19th, 2024, and then for the stuff that ONCA has special transition rules for, you can do it after October 19th, 2024. That's possible, but to avoid confusion, it is generally speaking easier to do it all at once and before October 19th, 2024.
Okay. So another question along that line is, what do we need to actually file by October 18th? And what can we keep in our records but not file? For example, I've read that we don't need to file our bylaws. Is this correct? I think you may have already touched
Yeah.
on this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so you don't need to file your bylaws. If you just have them in your records, that's fine, unless you're a registered charity. If you're a registered charity, you need to file them with the CRA, but the CRA doesn't have a deadline for this. The CRA just wants to have the documents filed once they've been updated. Um, the articles are what needs to be filed by October 19th, 2024, effectively. But as I mentioned, there are special transition rules that say that if these are the only rules you're changing in your articles, you could go past October 19th, 2024 and change them later. So it's more a question of best practices and confusion than a question of you are legally required to file them by October 19th, 2024. There's no rule that says you are legally required to file them by that date.
Okay. So a question from Diana. She says, we are currently unincorporated, but we have a constitution. We are moving towards incorporation. Do we have to amend our constitution, or do we just incorporate with new articles?
So that depends what's in your constitution. If your constitution is completely consistent with ONCA, then you know, a nonprofit could simply incorporate and maintain its governing documents. However, when an organization incorporates, it is required to have a first board meeting, and at that first board meeting, pass a set of bylaws, or you might call it your constitution, and then have a first members meeting that then approves those past bylaws or constitution. So even though the document may have existed before the organization became incorporated, once it's incorporated, it has to be actively passed by the board and then the members in order to be adopted. So if it's completely compliant with ONCA, then that's all that needs to be done. It just needs to be passed. But if it's not compliant with ONCA, then you can't just pass it. There needs to be changes in order to make it compliant with ONCA.
Okay. Some questions here around voting methods and especially specifically proxies. So our current voting method is in person at the annual meeting. I understand that we need to update our approach to include voting through other methods. We are okay with that. We currently do not mention use of proxies. Therefore, by default, they are excluded. Is that okay that we specifically exclude the use of proxies in our updated bylaws?
Yep. So there's no requirement to allow for proxy voting under ONCA. If you don't say anything about proxies, they're not allowed. So you can either explicitly say proxies are not allowed, or you can just be silent on the issue, and then in that case, proxies are not allowed. Just while we're talking about proxies, one thing I want to mention, because this is a source of major confusion, especially for organizations whose board and members are the same people. Under ONCA, proxy voting is allowed for members' meetings if your governing documents provide for it, but proxy voting is never allowed for board meetings. Okay, even if your bylaws say it's allowed, it's not allowed for board meetings, period.
Okay. Question here around the resolutions that happen at a members' meeting says, do we have to have a separate list available of the resolutions from members' meetings, or can these be included in meeting minutes? Similarly, do we need a list of board directors for each year in a separate place, or can these be included in the minutes of the board meeting?
Yeah, I love this question. I've gotten
Hmm.
it a few times. This is where we really get reminded that it's like it's a law and not necessarily a best practice. ONCA has a list of documents that nonprofits are expected to keep, and it lists resolutions and then it lists minutes. And so occasionally I get the question, wouldn't the resolutions be in the minutes? Why are these listed separately? The answer is you can pass a resolution outside of a members meeting or outside of a board meeting if it gets unanimous support, and you're required to keep those resolutions. So ONCA has to contemplate in its list resolutions separately from minutes. Um, as a result, there's a separate obligation to keep resolutions and a separate obligation to keep minutes, which seems like very artificial, very legalistic. Practically speaking, if you have the exact text of your resolutions recorded in your minutes, I can't see how it would ever be a problem because think about who would raise the issue. If somebody's raising an issue, it means they want to see the text of the resolution. If you can provide them the text of the resolution, the fact that you keep it in your minutes or outside your minutes, I cannot imagine how that would ever be an issue. But you know, that's the difference between legal information and legal advice. Legal information is ONCA technically requires you to keep resolutions and requires you to keep minutes. Practically speaking, if you have the text of the resolution, I don't know that it matters.
Okay.
Uh,
And then one of the last questions we've got specifically on bylaws says we've been editing for clarity, inclusivity, and spelling our bylaws on an ongoing basis over the past 3 years. With ONCA, do we only need to keep the most recent copy of our bylaws?
No, you are required to keep every version of your bylaws. And just so you understand why, if a dispute ever emerged about an issue that happened, let's say 5 years ago, because generally speaking, the events and when the dispute occurs are not at the same time always. Often what happens is some decision is made, 2 years later, somebody takes issue with that decision, okay? What you need to know is what were the rules that applied at that time. And so not only should nonprofits keep, not only are nonprofits required to keep all of their versions of their bylaws dating back to their founding, but an additional element that I would say is a good stylistic element, is more in the vein of a best practice, is clearly dating your bylaws. So that might be on the cover page saying, you know, this was effective as of this date. And if you use our bylaw builder, you will see that the bylaws that it spits out actually has a date not only for the bylaws as a whole, but for each section of the bylaws, saying the last time this section was amended was, you know, such and such a date. And that helps you keep track of, you know, when did we do our last comprehensive check versus doing only minor fixes to a particular section. So that's not legally required, but it's a good idea. And if there ever is a governance dispute and you are, you know, seeking legal advice, you don't want your lawyer to be wasting time trying to figure out the dating of documents that you've provided them. You want that to be as clear as possible, and that actually saves money and time.
So in that vein, another question that's come up is, so if we need to keep bylaws for the for the life of the organization, what about meeting minutes?
Yes. Yes, you're required to keep all of them.
Okay, all right. In the chat, we have a question that says, does the chair or president have to sit on the board of directors, or can that person be a member of the executive? And does the board of directors have to meet a minimum amount of time per year? Our board does not have a chair or president and only meets 3 times per year. Our executive committee has a chair and meets monthly.
ONCA requires that nonprofit corporations have a chair. That is required. Somebody has to have that role. The chair has to be a director. Okay, they have to be a member of the board. So that's pretty non-negotiable. And in fact, if you go to make filings in the online system, it will reject those filings if you haven't entered an officer position with the title chair. So you can look forward to those frustrating experiences. Um, to the question of how often does a board need to meet, I'll give you different layers to this question, layers of answers. So number one, technically speaking, the answer is 0 times. You could do everything through unanimous written resolutions outside of a board meeting. So if you pass a resolution before the members meeting, approving the financial statements, and you pass a unanimous written resolution after a members meeting, appointing the officers, and certain other legally required steps, that can all be done on paper and you could never meet. Okay. So that's the like absolute bare bones answer. The step up from that is you have a meeting at least 2 times a year before the members meeting and after the members meeting to do the things I just described. But the more practical answer is the board has a fiduciary duty to oversee the work of the nonprofit and to exercise oversight and good judgment on an ongoing basis. How frequently they need to meet to fulfill this duty depends entirely on the circumstances and the situation. An organization that is going through a crisis period, let's say it's early in COVID, or you're selling a building, or you're engaging in a merger, or something like that, it's not unreasonable. I would go so far as to say it is reasonable to expect a board to be meeting bi-weekly, weekly even during a period like that. And other times when everything is running smoothly and there are staff and the board is really just making sure there aren't any issues, maybe they're meeting quarterly, right? Maybe they're meeting far more infrequently. Maybe they just need to be provided updates and they will decide to meet on an ad hoc basis. But it's a contextual determination, and the directors basically need to decide we have a duty to fulfill. How often do we need to meet to fulfill that duty?
Okay. Um, Question here from the Village Theatre Waterdown. Is there a formal review of the updated bylaws to ensure that it meets the requirements of the new act? Can you explain how this might work?
So there's no formal review. You can choose to work with a lawyer or not. There's no legal requirement to work with a lawyer. I've written a blog post on the ONN website. Let me just get the link for that. Taking okay. Process. This blog post discusses some of the considerations when working with a lawyer. And the bottom line is it's not all or nothing. So you can do a lot of the work yourself and get a lawyer to review it. And even if you got a lawyer to do absolutely everything, if you got the Rolls Royce of legal services from a total expert, I would caution against basically fooling yourself into thinking they've done everything for you, because they can't for 2 reasons. Number one, unless this lawyer happens to be very familiar with your particular organization, they will be unable to produce a set of governing documents that is specifically tailored to the realities, the operating realities of your governance, the personalities, the psychology, the politics, etc. Right? Only you can determine if the governing documents that have been produced are reflective of your operational realities. The second thing that no lawyer can do for you, you can only do for yourselves, is that at the end of the day, compliance isn't just about what you've written down on paper. It's about how you take what you've written down on paper and actually put it into practice. Unless you have the money to have a lawyer breathing down your neck perpetually, right? They aren't there all the time. They write the documents which may be ONCA compliant, and then they go away. And then it's for you to actually interpret and apply those governing documents. And if you haven't understood them because you got somebody else to write them for you, you may not apply them accurately, or they may not be realistic for your kind of governance reality. So only you can do the work of ensuring that they are compliant in how you actually implement them. So for all those reasons, no, there is no official compliance check. But if you want, you can work with a lawyer. And there is a directory on our website of lawyers who we neither vet nor specifically recommend, but we do confirm that part of their legal practice includes nonprofits. So I've put that link in the chat.
Fantastic. So question here says, and this is around finances and audits and how that all ties in. It says our
Mhm.
annual revenue is around $50,000. Our current bylaws have a provision for an external audit when revenues exceed $500,000. What are the audit requirements? When do external people need to be engaged? What is the scope for the review?
Okay. So for this question, I am actually going to share my screen because there are a lot of numbers and it's just simpler for me to show you the page. So under Run a Nonprofit, there's a page called Finances. And the bottom line is under ONCA. Every nonprofit needs to get an audit each and every year, but some nonprofits have the ability to pass what's called an extraordinary resolution at a members meeting and waive that requirement to get an audit. So the default is you get an audit unless you can waive it. So who can waive it and how do you go about waiving it? So if you go under, do we have to get an audit? You will see that whether or not you can waive it and what you have to get instead of an audit depends on two factors, your annual revenue and if you are what's called a public benefit corporation. There is another page explaining what a public benefit corporation is. But just in brief, an organization is a public benefit corporation if either A, it's a charity, or B, if last year it got more than $10,000 from the government or from donations or grants from people or organizations who are not your members or employees or their close relations. The idea here is that if you're either a charity or you got public funding above $10,000 collectively, then you have certain higher accountability requirements. Okay, so who is required to get an audit and who can waive it? If you have annual revenue under $100,000, by default, you're required to get an audit, but you can waive it by passing an extraordinary resolution at a members meeting. An extraordinary resolution means that you take a vote at a members meeting that's supported by 80% or more of the votes cast at that meeting. So it doesn't have to be 80% or more of all your members. It's just 80% or more of the votes cast at that meeting. Um, if you waive the audit, you're only waiving it for this year. If you want to waive it next year, you would have to pass another resolution. So if you're under $100,000, you pass that resolution, you're fine. You still have to prepare financial statements, but you don't have to get them externally reviewed. If you have annual revenue between 100,000 and 500,000, whether by default you have to get an audit, you have the ability to waive the audit. But if you are a public benefit corporation, you need to get a review engagement. If you are not a public benefit corporation, you can waive all external financial review. Okay, you still have to prepare financial statements, but you don't have to get them externally reviewed. If you have annual revenue above 500,000, by default, you need to get an audit. And if you are a public benefit corporation, you have to get that audit. You're not allowed to waive it. If you are not a public benefit corporation with annual revenue and you have annual revenue above 500,000, by default, you have to get an audit. You can pass an extraordinary resolution to waive the audit, but you still have to at least get what's called a review engagement. So what is a review engagement? I'll explain what a review engagement is by contrast to an audit. And these terms are defined on this page, so you can learn more here. You don't have to memorize everything I'm saying. An audit is where a chartered professional accountant, a CPA, comes in, looks at your source documents, like your receipts and invoices, looks at your financial policies, like your signing authorities, looks at your financial statements, like your balance sheet and your cash flow, and based on all that, decides whether or not they can provide reasonable assurance that your financial statements are a reliable reflection of your organization's financial position. Okay. A review engagement, by contrast, is faster and it's cheaper because it's less extensive and doesn't provide the same level of assurance. So again, it's a CPA coming in, looking at your source documents, looking at your financial policies, looking at your financial statements. But at the end of the day, what they're looking for is whether your financial statements are a, quote, plausible reflection of your financial position, which just means that in their review, they didn't see any red flags. So that is not the same kind of standard. So for organizations with simpler finances and not so many external stakeholders and so on, a review engagement may be perfectly fine. Um, but for other organizations, especially those that have external funders, often those external funders require that there be an audit. So it's a conversation for every organization to have internally and potentially with their funders.
Okay, great. We have a couple of questions of the ones that were submitted prior that go back to speaking a little bit about board member compensation that I missed earlier. So I'm going to ask the two of them sort of together. The one says, question about board director compensation. What is reasonable and how is it broken down? For example, can you pay for specific jobs a board member may undertake or pay an honorarium? And then it says, currently we give compensation to board members who run ski trips. You must be a board member to do that. Can we do that going forward? And if so, how do we structure it?
So I can't specifically speak to your organization situation, but what I can say is that for a nonprofit that's not a charity, yes, you can pay directors for work they do, but it has to be subject to conflict of interest rules. So, for example, if a certain kind of job is limited to a director, you need to be a director in order to be paid for this kind of job. You know, if someone ever challenged that in court, an organization would need to be able to explain to the court why it should be limited to directors. Is there truly no one else who is qualified and able to do the same job? If the answer is there are others who are qualified and able to do the same job, then the directors are maybe getting an unfair advantage by virtue of their director position to get these paid jobs. So if you can justify it, that's one thing. But if you cannot justify it, then an organization needs to act in its own best interest, and that may involve opening up the pool of candidates as wide as possible to get the best price and to get the most qualified candidate to run the um, uh, to run whatever programming it is.
Okay, great. So that was, we've gone through all the questions that were submitted ahead of time, and we've also gone through the questions that were submitted so far in the chat. Are there any questions that people have specifically that so you can either raise your hand and I can call on you? We just do have a quick question here from Diana. It says we currently get looks like $2,500 to $4,500 in a community fund and around $4,500 in sponsorship. So totally just under $10,000 right now. Does sponsorship count in the public benefit corporation numbers?
Yeah, so great question. The short answer is it depends on the what exactly that sponsorship consists of. So the Act uses the term in order when defining what money counts towards public benefit corporation status, it uses the term gifts or donations. So sponsorship is not a legally defined term. In some cases, what you might call sponsorship is actually a gift or donation, but there's just some expression of gratitude for the gift or donation. So your local business gives a gift of $10,000 to the nonprofit, and you say thank you to them. Great. That's very nice. And everyone calls it a sponsorship. Well, in that case, it actually is probably a gift. But another thing that people or type of relationship that people often call a sponsorship is where money goes to the nonprofit, and in exchange, the nonprofit offers essentially advertising services. So they legally bind themselves, they legally commit themselves to do things like, including the business or donor's name in the newsletter or mentioning them at a certain time at an event or having their banner up or something like that. In that case, you actually have a contract and there's an exchange of value going back and forth. The nonprofit gets the money and the sponsor gets advertising services. So in that case, it is an exchange and therefore it's not a gift or donation. So that kind of sponsorship would not count towards the public benefit corporation status. So the fundamental question you're asking yourself is not, do we call it a sponsorship or not? It's, is this really a gift or not? And in order to determine that, it can be very contextual, but the first question to ask is is there an exchange of value going on here? Are we legally binding ourselves to give the person who's giving us money something in exchange? If the answer is yes, then it may be an exchange and not a gift. And so does it count towards public benefit corporation status?
Okay, great. Question that's just popped up in the chat. Question, are officers as legally liable in a not-for-profit organization as directors?
Yeah, so that hasn't come up, so don't worry. And even if it had, it would always be worth revisiting. So the answer is no. Directors are legally obligated for certain specific things beyond their general fiduciary duties. For example, if EI and CPP has not been remitted, the directors are liable for the EI and CPP amounts. If employees have not been paid and the organization dissolves and can't pay its employees as part of the dissolution process, the directors are liable up to 6 months vacation pay and certain other pay to actually pay the employees. So those are liabilities that attach specifically to the directors. In other respects, both directors and officers are liable in a similar way because both directors and officers are what's called fiduciaries, meaning they have a legal responsibility to put the interests of the nonprofit ahead of their own when they make decisions or do things on behalf of the nonprofit. So, for example, when a board votes on a contract to hire somebody, the directors are responsible to put the interests of the organization ahead of their own. Similarly, if an officer has been charged with the responsibility to hire somebody, they are similarly responsible to, for example, not just hire their cousin because they want to give their cousin work, but to put the interests of the nonprofit first. So in some ways, they have similar liabilities, but some liabilities are specific to directors.
Okay, great. Denise just was asking for a clarification around your response to Diana's question around sponsorships, gifts, and donations, and how they applied to the public benefit corporation numbers. She's asked, do these exchanges, and I'm assuming she's meaning the sponsorship exchanges, do they still get a tax donation receipt?
So the answer is depends on the situation. The CRA has a number of pages dealing with this exact issue of sponsorship and charities. So the first thing I would do is recommend that you go to the CRA pages on sponsorship. So go to the CRA Charities Directorate website and search sponsorship, and you'll find a few different pages that come up, and they have different helpful information. But the bottom line is a donation receipt can only be issued for gifts. And the value of that donation receipt, if the donor is getting anything of value in exchange, so for example, let's say somebody buys a ticket to a gala and they get a meal. Okay, so the ticket to the gala is $180, but the value of the meal is $50. Okay, so they could get a donation receipt for the ticket, but it would be $180 minus $50. So the receipt that they're getting is only $130, right? So similarly, if somebody is giving $10,000 in sponsorship. And yes, you are legally committing yourself to doing certain advertising things on their behalf, but the value of that advertising is only really $500 in value. Then in theory, you can issue a donation receipt for $9,500. But it is notoriously difficult to valuate advertising and valuate sponsorship. So CRA strongly cautions on their website that says, they say, if you cannot um, confidently assign a value to the benefit the donor is getting, then you can't issue a receipt. So even though you can confidently say, the value of the advertising is somewhere between 500 and 1,000, but you can't say exactly what it is. The fact that you can't assign a precise number, you can't back that up with a methodology, for example, it means you can't issue an accurate receipt. So, and if you can't issue an accurate receipt, you can't issue a receipt altogether. So in many cases, it is not possible to issue a receipt for sponsorship, and this may be an area for legal advice. There are some workarounds, such as doing the gift separately from the sponsorship. And there are just two different amounts. There are consequences to that. So, for example, if you are, for example, going out to your sponsors and saying there's a gold sponsor and you need to give us $50,000 for that, and a silver sponsor and it's 25,000, and a bronze sponsor and it's 10,000, okay? But behind the scenes, you're doing this kind of legal sleight of hand where you're saying we're going to count 40 of the thousand of those dollars as a gift and $10,000 with the sponsorship contract. Well, if you publicly are communicating that they are $50,000 sponsor, you are at the very least giving the impression that the two things are linked. And you can be sure if CRA auditors are ever looking at it, they're going to notice that. And they're going to ask questions about that. And so you're going to have to be able to answer for what you're doing. So even if you come out, uh, even if you can convince them at the end of the day, the time and expense and cost of the back and forth in itself is something to be wary of. So all of that is just to say the simple answer is, generally speaking, no, you cannot issue a tax receipt for sponsorship if you cannot assess the value of the what you're giving to the donor.
Okay, great. Just a confirmation from Crispin, just wants to confirm that you have to keep all your bylaws and board meeting minutes, and there's no retention bylaw limiting the time frame you need to keep these documents.
That's correct. What I would add here is some of you may have heard what I said earlier and started sweating. We've been around 60 years, and there are entire decades missing from our minutes and so on. Oh no, what's going to happen? So the first thing I remind people is there are no ONCA police. Okay, so it's nobody's job in the government to knock on your door and ask you, do you have every single set of minutes from every meeting going back 60 years? That's nobody's job. Okay, so the where it might come up is if a legal issue arises from a year in the past, and in order to defend against the charge that the board didn't do its due diligence or whatever, you want to be able to point to records showing that in fact you discussed it robustly and you sought advice and so on. If you don't have your minutes, then you don't have the benefit of being able to point to those records. So that's not the end of the world. There may be other ways to prove that you did your due diligence, but it does you're losing out on the benefit of one of the of evidence and resources you might want to rely on. How likely litigation is to occur will vary completely based on what kind of subsector you're in, how you operate, and so on. So, for example, if you were an animal welfare organization, I would say you better dot your I's and cross your T's, because they are very often dragged into the media. They are very often dragged into litigation and so on. But there are many types of organizations that, even if they're completely dysfunctional, it's never going to be taken to court. They can go decades and decades and nobody's ever going to notice. So the reality of a risk, the reality is that you need to do a risk assessment about how adequate are your records are and what could happen, if you don't have perfect records. But it may simply not be possible to go back and reconstruct those minutes, and the law can't demand of you the impossible.
So this is where we put our hand up now and say, now that we've done ONCA, we will make sure that we keep our minutes
Right,
going forward.
exactly.
So a question that I get quite often in my role as the director here is the concern from folks when we start thinking about, you have to have your bylaws approved and I think by your members.
Hmm.
And organizations will say, I have a membership of 100 people.
Hmm.
And I never get 100 people out of my annual general meeting, but I do make quorum.
Hmm.
So can you clarify if our bylaws said you had to have 2/3 approval at a meeting? Is that 2/3 of my 100 members or 2/3 of the members who bothered to show up for the meeting?
So the wording of your governing documents matters. So I can't comment on just a slice of the wording, but generally speaking, approval thresholds refer to who's at the meeting. It's not, they don't generally refer to a percentage of all the members. But your governing
Okay.
documents may change that depending on how they're worded. So that's something to look out for.
Okay. Then Susan Prisher's just asked here in the chat, she says, can I confirm that if we are not changing the membership categories or the range of numbers of directors, can we keep them in the bylaws and not amend the articles?
That's correct. If you are not making any changes to your membership categories, then you can keep them in the bylaws. Now, the risk of doing this is that, remember what I said at the beginning in acknowledging the land here, and we need to kind of have a long view of things, which is easier in Manitoba. You're not writing for yourselves. You are writing for the board 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road. They may have no clue about ONCA. They may assume whatever's in the bylaws, that's all I need to read and that's all I need to know. And if they want to make a change to the bylaws, they will see that, oh, the membership classes are listed in the bylaws. Great. All I need to do is change the bylaws and I'll change the membership classes. And so they won't make the change to the articles, which they are in fact required to make if they want to make a change. And that's when you run into problems because um, if you eliminate your membership classes in your bylaws and don't effectively replace them, then you're in a legal limbo state, which is not good.
Question from Amelia. What if we can't find our letters patent?
So if you cannot find your letters patent and you are provincially incorporated and you're not a special act corporation, then you can order them from the Ontario Business Registry. So let me get that up and I'll actually give you a quick tour of the registry while we're here. So here's the Ontario Business Registry. I just Googled Ontario Business Registry and I scrolled past the sketchy ads trying to look like their government websites. What you want to see is ontario.ca at the beginning. So I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to go to search for a business or not-for-profit corporation. I will click on that and I'm going to search for the legal name of my nonprofit. Okay, so not just the name my nonprofit goes by in the community, but the legal name, the kind of name that appears on contracts, that kind of thing. So I'm going to look for Ontario Nonprofit Network. And there are advanced searches if you're having trouble finding yourself, but I'm just going to click search. I'm going to scroll down. Oh, there we are. Okay, and you can see the kind of information that the public can get on you. I'm going to click on my organization. And you see a bit more information on the top right. There is a button that signals that you can click and you can start making changes, such as if your directors change, if your address changes, and so on. So you would click on the right side button here. But here we're trying to get our letters patent. So we're going to click on Request Search Products here in the top left. So I click on Request Search Products. And it gives me three options for how I can order documents about my nonprofit. I can order online from the ministry, online from an authorized service provider, or by mail directly from the ministry, and there's some waiting involved in that. Now, why anyone would order online from an authorized service provider, I don't know. It's the same information, and it's just an additional fee. There may be a situation in which it's advisable, but I haven't seen it yet. So I would say pretty much always click online from the ministry. So I click online from the ministry and it gives me options of what I can order. So if I order a profile report, this will tell me who the government currently has listed as the directors. And currently has listed as the address of the nonprofit. So this is a great document to order to see if your governing document, if your filings are actually up to date with the government. And if they're not, then you have to make some filings. Uh, there's also a certificate of status, which confirms that you're sort of in good standing with the government. But the relevant document you want to order is unfortunately very generically named document copies. If you click and order this for last time I checked the low price of $3.50, it would be a steal at twice the price. It's really a great price. Then you get a whole package, a whole archive package of documents relating to your nonprofit, including your letters patent. If you ever made changes to your letters patent, you would have what are called are essentially articles of amendment. Um, you would it also includes past filings and so on. So it's a great walk down memory lane. You may see names you haven't seen in decades and think, oh, this guy, he's dead. This guy, oh, he doesn't want anything to do with us anymore. So if you have an upcoming anniversary, it's a great source for slideshow material, but you will get your letters patent. So if you don't know where your letters patent is, then I would suggest going to the Ontario Business Registry and ordering it.
Great. There's a request if you could just pop that website back into the chat, that would be great.
Sure.
We have about 6-7 minutes left. I appreciate everyone being here. Do we have any other last minute pressing questions? And just a reminder that we are recording this, so you will receive a copy of this recording as well. So feel free to raise your hand or pop a question into the chat. Give people a moment to do that. I just want to also let you know that we have had Benjamin here at Volunteer Halton a couple of times over the past couple of years to talk about the ONCA process. When I send out this recording, I will include the recordings to our previous 2 meetings with Benjamin. The first was in, I believe, January of 2022, where he really went through in quite a bit of detail around what the ONCA is and how it applies, and why you should be doing it, expanding on what he started off this presentation with. And then our second meeting with Benjamin was frequently asked questions that have been collected by the Ontario Nonprofit Project that had been coming in. I believe we got nearly 50 or 52 of the 100 most frequently asked questions. So you'll get that one as well, and your question might be there. I don't see any other questions that are coming up. Any last minute things you want to recommend that people do, Benjamin, as they're preparing with ONCA? Possibly put your email address in that chat
Sure.
too.
Sure, I'll put my email in. We can't provide legal advice or representation, but I can provide legal information. Um, as I mentioned at the beginning, or towards the beginning, this is an opportunity to really rethink your governance. And that doesn't just have to be what's the minimum we need to do to comply with the ONCA. While you have the hood open, so to speak, you can take this opportunity to ask some more fundamental questions about your governance. The Ontario Nonprofit Network has a whole group of resources from a project called Reimagining Governance, where you can see how to maybe build better relationships with your stakeholders and so on. And so I would encourage you to check those out on the Ontario Nonprofit Network website. So I'll get the chat for I'll put in the chat for that, and
Great.
then.
And there's just a quick question: when will the new financial requirements take effect? I believe they take effect at the same time that the whole ONCA takes effect. This is October 19th. Is that correct?
So the financial review requirements took effect on October 19th, 2021, because generally speaking, well, so prior to ONCA, um, most nonprofits were just required to get an audit period. Some nonprofits had in their bylaws that they are required to get an audit, which they didn't have to have, but it kind of cemented this idea that they had to get an audit. So if you still have that in your bylaws, that continues to apply during this transition period. And so you don't even have the flexibility I mentioned of when you can pass an extraordinary resolution. But if you don't have a provision like that in your governing documents, then the ONCA rules simply started applying on October 19th, 2021, because you had nothing to the contrary. Unless you are under a special act that I haven't seen yet, you couldn't have had a more flexible set of rules than ONCA allows that would have been valid. So, for example, if you are an Ontario Corporations Act nonprofit and you said, for example, we're only required to ever get a review engagement, that would not have been valid before ONCA took effect, and it's still not valid. In such a case, the ONCA rules that we went over for financial review would apply as of October 19th, 2021.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for being here. Just wanted to highlight a couple of things that are also coming up. Benjamin, thank you so much for this great workshop. This was fantastic. I always learn a lot. I saw lots of people writing things down. You will get the recording, and the chat information is there. I will pull out several of these things and put them into the follow-up email. Speaking of a follow-up email, you will get an evaluation form, both from ONN and myself. We really appreciate you taking some time to provide your feedback on this workshop and the information that you heard. Also just want to pull up the fact that CDH and Volunteer Halton have a few activities coming up that you might be interested in. CDH has been releasing a series called the Our Halton series. And next week on Thursday, the 22nd, we are releasing our report on diversity, equity, and inclusion in Halton region. So I will add the link to that. This will be an online discussion, and we are planning an in-person event for later on in the spring. This will be report 6, I believe, of our series. And our series includes information on no, I thought 5 was the volunteer report. Was it 5? Okay. Report 5. Don't get ahead of myself. Risha's editing like mad. But we have reports on the state of women in Halton region, volunteerism, income inequity, and housing. So if those are of interest to the work that you do in community, you can find all of those reports on our website, but we will also be releasing diversity. To follow along governance, I'll be hosting a board succession planning workshop on February the 27th, also online. So if you are in the process of doing that succession planning or wondering how do I get started, because I've had board members that have been around forever who would really like to leave, let's have you come out on the 27th and we will talk about that. And also for those organizations who are in Halton region, as we get ready to prepare for National Volunteer Week, which is in April, we will be releasing our information on our upcoming awards. So watch your emails for that. And today is the first day of Nonprofit Appreciation Week. So thank you so much for being here. Great way to kick off the week, but watch our social media and ONN social media for great information on the fantastic work that the 58,000 nonprofits in Ontario do in community. But thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to stop this recording.
And I'll just note that I put the survey in